In this presentation you'll learn of the following subjects. Why carburize? A brief history of carburizing. The diffusion theory of carbon into the surface of the steel. Methods of carburizing. Potential process variables. Why carburize? Carburizing is perhaps the oldest of all the major surface treatment processes. It is a process that's been around for many centuries and will continue to be around for many more centuries. A process that's led the way to steel making simply by forging iron in a fire. The fire, made from wood and charcoal, provides the source of carbon, which is carbon monoxide, and the carbon diffuses into the surface of the iron. The forgings continued, and the hammering continued. The iron is reheated and more carbon is diffused into the iron until eventually it became steel. Then it could be heat treated to whatever hardness was required. For a fighting sword, a headsman's axe, or whatever other weapon of war was required. Therefore, it can be said that the process of carburizing was the process that led to the development of steel. One would ask the simple question, why carburize? Why is it necessary to carburize? What are the advantages of carburizing process? Before one can carburize, many engineering issues are necessary to be discussed and determined. Once these issues have been identified and settled upon, then the carburizing process can begin. This is one process method, or is one process method better than another? That will depend on the product's usage, its performance requirements, and of course the environment in which it will operate in. The reasons to carburize are many, and are given on the next slide are some of the issues for consideration for the process of carburizing. This describes the versatility of the process technology of carburizing in terms of accomplished mechanical properties. We can provide a surface that has good wear resistance, to provide a surface with good compressive stress, to provide a surface with good torque resistance, to provide a surface with a good impact strength, to create a component with a combination of high surface hardness and good core hardness, to create a surface with a hard compressive residual stress at the surface within a hard case. There are many choices and considerations that one can make and must make before finally selecting on the process of carburizing. First of all, the steel. Secondly, the process technique. Thirdly, distortion considerations. Fourthly, part performance. Part geometry. Economics. That is the cost of the equipment and the cost of the product. Surface metallurgy that is required. Core metallurgy that is required. The quench medium that is required and its availability. Tempering. Please remember that even though you've created fresh untempered martensite, which is unstable, it requires tempering. There's no single subject within this complete course of carburizing that is of greater or lesser importance. Each of the part chapters is as important as each other to the process of carburizing. It can be said that there is no one reason that is greater than another to say categorically, this is why you must carburize. The process of carburizing has entered a new dimension in terms of metallurgical understanding, process technology based on existing methods of heat treatment, greater demands on the product performance, process costs. The process of carburizing is perhaps the oldest method of surface treatment that is known today in today's manufacturing techniques and process technology. The process of carburizing was initiated when early man first started to work iron ore. His methods of working the iron was by the application of heat. His method and source of heat was the fire. It is known that wood is a hydrocarbon material and when burned will produce a carbon-rich gas. Early man created his fire to heat the iron without realizing what was happening, and that the carbon from the wood fire was beginning to enter into the surface of the iron. His continual working of the iron required heat, which meant more carbon was entering or diffusing into the surface of the iron. Early man was carburizing without even knowing it. In today's process technology, we know the method that early man was using is now known as pack carburizing. Pack carburizing is a method of creating the conditions with the steel being treated so that carbon will diffuse into the surface of the steel. Once the carbon is diffused into the surface of the steel, the whole process is allowed to cool down to room temperature and the steel removed from the container in which it was originally placed for the carburizing procedure. The following illustration shows a cross-section of a simply constructed process furnace, which is the heat source for the carburizing procedure. Within the interior of the furnace is placed a steel container which carries both the carburizing medium and the steel to be carburized. The steel container is sealed with a lid which is further sealed using fire clay or mud. This shows the simple pack carburizing furnace system, and as you can see, the process retort is centered in the inside of the furnace. The very simple rich carbon source that is used for pack carburizing procedure is that of simple charcoal. Degussa of West Germany developed a method of pack carburizing with a controlled carbon output. The first of these products was known as KG60, which means carburized granulate, which gives a 0.6% carbon potential. The second of their products was known as KG80, that is 0.8% carbon output. The third of their products was known as KG110, which is 1.1% carbon output. This was a very simple method of carburizing which required only a replenishment addition of approximately 10% new granulate. This shows the simple pack carburizing furnace system, and as you can see, the process retort is centered in the inside of the furnace. This shows the simple carburizing box with the components being immersed into the pack carburizing granulate and the furnace lid. Typical pack carburizing mediums: wood charcoal. This will produce a carbon-rich atmosphere but with no knowledge of the carbon output. Cast iron chips can produce a very rich carbon potential of approximately 2.3 up to 5% surface carbon. This shows the simple pack carburizing furnace system, and as you can see, the process retort is centered in the inside of the furnace. This shows the simple carburizing box with the components being immersed into the pack carburizing granulate and the furnace lid. In this presentation, we're focusing our attention on the simple process of pack carburizing. The pack carburizing method relies on the use of a carbon-rich material. One can use ordinary charcoal, however, the carbon output from the charcoal is never consistent. Companies did at one time manage their own brand of carburizing granulate, which contained wood charcoal plus an activator known as barium carbonate. This process product releases the amount of carbon monoxide, which is CO, which is derived from a solid carbon source. This activity is initiated at the surface of the steel to be carburized. The resulting decomposition is nascent carbon and carbon dioxide. The action is to release the carbon monoxide, which is caused by the thermal activity, which is temperature or heat. The activity is assisted by an energizer, as previously stated, barium carbonate, or potassium carbonate, or sodium carbonate. The energizers, whichever one is utilized, are present to aid the initial production of carbon dioxide from the carbon-rich source, resulting in the formation of carbon monoxide, which is the active gas at the surface of the material. The carbon monoxide will decompose to release nascent carbon. The presence of carbon will cause some concern at the steel surface, as it is to and can diffuse into the surface of the steel, thus causing what is known as grain boundary oxidation, or GBO. This is a guaranteed event that will occur with the form of packed carburizing. The following slide shows an illustration of diffused carbon after the process is completed and at the surface of the steel. You can see on this illustration, on the bars that are displayed, a dark ring on the outside of the periphery of the bars. That is the carbon that has diffused into the surface of the steel. You can see on this illustration, on the bars that are displayed, a dark ring on the outside of the periphery of the bars. That is the carbon that has diffused into the surface of the steel. It shows you a tree formation of the different methods of carburizing. On this presentation, we're focusing on packed carburizing. Our primary force is on packed carburizing procedure in this presentation. The last leg of the previous illustration tree shows 5 methods of carburizing: the packed method, the molten salt method, the gaseous atmosphere method, the low pressure vacuum carburizing, and the plasma assisted carburizing method. Packed carburizing compounds mixtures with activators. We see wood charcoal, and we can add to the wood charcoal 90% plus 10% of barium carbonate. We can have on B, wood charcoal 90% plus 10% sodium carbonate as the activator. On C, we can have wood charcoal with 75% wood charcoal plus 15% barium carbonate, plus some homemade methods of making the granulate coagulate. The carburizing container, when filled with the carburizing granulate, will contain air and is heated up to the carburizing temperature. The air will interact with the carburizing granulate, releasing both nitrogen, oxygen under those thermal conditions. At the selected process temperature and the approach up to the process temperature, the thermal condition will cause the oxygen to react with the carbon and form carbon monoxide. Once again, due to the thermal conditions, the carbon monoxide will interact with the surface of the steel, and the carbon will release nascent carbon or atomic carbon into plus carbon dioxide. And it is the carbon dioxide that we have a great concern with. The surface reactions during packed carburizing. Reaction 1 is carbon plus oxygen, which equals carbon dioxide. Reaction 2 shows 2 parts carbon plus oxygen, which equals a reversible reaction, carbon monoxide. Reaction 3, we have carbon dioxide plus carbon, which again releases through a reversible reaction, carbon monoxide. Reaction 4 is 2 parts of carbon monoxide plus carbon dioxide equals nascent carbon. Although the charcoal will supply carbon for the diffusion into the surface of the steel, the activator will assist in the reduction of carbon monoxide. It will be necessary after each charge or load has been completed to replenish the charcoal with an approximate addition of about 10 to 12% of new charcoal and activator. When preparing the process container for the charcoal granulate and the steel to be carburized, it will be necessary to ensure that there is approximately 50 millimeters of charcoal and activator underneath the steel and around the steel to be processed over the top and below. A simple loose-fitting lid should be placed on the top of the loaded container and simply sealed with fire clay or mud to contain the process gases developed within the container during its complete cycle at temperature. As previously stated, one must always be aware of the presence of oxygen within the process retort being derived from the decomposition of air. This will cause intergranular oxidation or grain boundary oxidation, known as GBO. The depth of the oxidation will depend on the process cycle time in relation to the case depth required. Obviously, the deeper the case depth, the deeper the GBO. Process requirements. The process of carburizing is based simply on the following parameters: time at temperature, process temperature, process gas composition, steel composition, pre-grain size. The diffusion of carbon into the surface of the steel will be monitored by a time factor. The time factor is a complex formula and based upon the diffusion of carbon into the surface of the steel. The rate of elemental diffusion into the steel surface is not dependent on the element that is being decomposed, such as carbon. The principal formula is based on fixed first and second laws of diffusion. Those are very complex. As previously stated, those two formulas are really extremely complex formulations. Continuing with our discussion on the diffusion, the rate of diffusion will follow the law of diffusion as defined by Harris in the 1940s. Harris took a great deal of time to explore fixed first and second law. And he came up with a very simple formulation based upon a plain carbon steel, not an alloy steel, but a plain carbon steel. And it is simply the case depth equals the square root of time multiplied by a factor. T equals time and F equals the factor, which is temperature derived. The formula is an approximation of time versus temperature and represents the total case, not the effective case, but the total case depth of a plain carbon steel. The formula is based on plain carbon steels and does not account for alloy carburizing steel, but can be used simply as a guide. It does not take into account the effects of the alloying elements such as chromium, nickel and other alloying elements that have been added. The depth of form case must be tested for hardness after quenching. Note, after quenching. Depending on the selected load and hardness test machine will determine if carburizing has taken place or if the indenter has pierced the formed case and given an average reading between the case and the core. The depth of carbon penetration is, as previously described, a function of time and temperature in order to diffuse the carbon into the steel surface. The depth of hardness penetration will be dependent on the carbon content of the carburized layer, and providing that only martensite is formed in the case when quenched from the carburizing after it's cooled down and reheated. And this would be equivalent to a depth of carbon penetration down to 0.4% carbon potential. The core hardness will be dependent on the austenitizing temperature chosen to harden the formed case. If the selected austenitizing temperature goes too high, then the core hardness will be correspondingly high. If the selected austenitizing temperature is too low, then there is a likelihood of a softer core hardness and a potential for incomplete transformation to occur on the formed case. The core hardness will also depend on the chemistry of the steel in question. The purpose of core hardening treatment is to give support to the freshly formed martensitic case. If the hardness of the core is too low, and the load that could be applied to the surface of the formed case, then there is a strong likelihood that the formed case will collapse due to lack of core support. When carburizing by the pack carburizing method, then the steel component, if necessary, can be selectively carburized and quenched. Generally, for pack carburizing, the method of stop-off will either be copper plating or copper painting. There are other methods of reputable stop-off agents that can perform just as good as the copper stop-off. When pack carburizing, the most serious difficulty is establishing the time at which the component to be carburized and the process container have reached the selected carburizing temperature. The general selected process temperature for pack carburizing is between 890 degrees centigrade up to 920 degrees centigrade. The process furnace heating chamber will reach the set point carburizing temperature long before the contents of the process container also reach the carburizing temperature. Remember that you should place the container in the furnace process chamber only when you have assumed that it is in the center. This is what makes pack carburizing a very difficult procedure to establish the time at which one could commence the cycle time at temperature. The method of establishing if the process container is at temperature is purely by sight of eye. And based upon that, all you will see is the external surface of the process carburizing box. You will not see the internals of the process box. Based on the Harris formula, the following approximate values can be used to approximate the process cycle time at a process temperature of 900 degrees centigrade. It's showing case depths and the factor at different temperatures right up to the extreme. A typical carburizing cycle with suggested temperatures. Bear in mind these are suggested temperatures. Once the component has been carburized by pack methods, the process container is removed from the furnace and allowed to free cool to room temperature. The container can now be opened by breaking the fireclay seal and removing the lid. Now the carburized components can be removed. It should be remembered that the carburized component has been at an elevated temperature for an extended period of time. During its residence time at the elevated temperature, and other phenomena has occurred, which is that of grain growth. Grain growth will occur due to the varying cycle time lengths of the carburizing process. This does not matter what method is selected, grain growth will occur. The grain growth has occurred in the core of the material and the carburized component area, and of course in the carburized case. Grain growth is a function of residence time at the process temperature and the process temperature itself. Remember, grain growth occurs because of time at temperature. Depending on the nature and function of the component, it should be necessary to perform an intermediate process, which is generally known as a refining process. This is a supplementary thermal heat treatment operation, which simply means to normalize the now excessive grain size to a normal fine grain material, and to accomplish the final grain size of approximately 6 to 8. This will reduce the risk of premature failure during operation. The refining operation simply necessitates raising the temperature of the carburized component up to a process temperature of approximately 880 degrees centigrade. Holding at that temperature until equalization with the furnace temperature has occurred, and this is simply followed by cooling. It will further reduce the risk of surface cracking through the carburized case. Please bear in mind that at the selected process temperature for refining, the carburized case will need protection against surface oxidation. In addition to this, if the component is held at an extensive period of time at the selected refining temperature, then the newly formed case will begin to diffuse further into the steel, which will be accompanied by a dilution effect on the surface of the carburized steel. This is a photomicrograph of a carburized bearing and the formed carburized case. The arrow is pointing to the formed carburized case. Once the case has been formed in the surface of the component, it is now necessary to understand the occurrence of the formation of the carburized case. It's now necessary to consider what is known as the iron-carbon equilibrium diagram, and to gain an understanding of the phase changes that have occurred during the process of carburizing. Shows the iron-carbon equilibrium diagram. Where one is carburized is in the red area above the yellow area of this illustration, which has a different grain phase condition of face-centered cubic, as opposed to in the yellow condition it has a body-centered cubic. Each one has a different volumetric size. The carburizing procedure commences from the ferrite region and progresses into the austenite region. As the names imply, there is a change that occurs within the steel itself, and the changes are shown in the next slide. Ferrite. Body-centered cubic lattice structure, which equals 9 atoms, that is 1 on each corner and 1 in the center. The structure is stable up to an approximate temperature of 720 degrees centigrade. Then it begins to progressively reorient its structure through the mixed phase area, and the temperature at the temperature of 720 is where the steel loses its magnetic property and recovers it on cool down back through that temperature. Shows the ferrite structure. You'll notice 9 atoms, 1 on each corner and 1 in the center. But please take note of the size. Austenite. Once the steel has reached the austenite changeover line, that is the A3 line, then the reorientation of the structure has been completed to a new phase, which is known as face-centered cubic lattice. This now has a total of 14 atoms, 1 on each corner and 1 in the center of each face. The structure is larger now than the body-centered structure. The apparent additional atoms have come due to the decomposition of the ferrite and reorientation to FCC of the face-centered cubic lattice structure. Once again, please take note of the size comparison. You will notice that it is larger in volume, so therefore a size change has occurred in the steel during the carburizing procedure. We've now introduced carbon into the surface of the component that we've processed by carburizing. The aim has been to accomplish a surface carbon content percentage of approximately 0.7 up to approximately 0.9. The following Carburise process has been followed when and where necessary by the process of refining and is now necessary to make the steel surface hard. The hardening of the carburized steel surface is accomplished once again by reheating the carburized steel up to a temperature of approximately 780 degrees centigrade to approximately 810 degrees centigrade. The selected temperature is dependent on the steel chemistry and the core property required. The carburized steel component is heated up to the selected set point temperature, followed by equalizing the process temperature throughout the cross-section of the steel component. Once this has been accomplished, the steel is now removed from the process furnace and cooled down rapidly by quenching it into an appropriate quenching medium. The objective is now to transform the phase structure into a new structure which is known as martensite. The structure of the new phases of martensite is shown in the next slide. Martensite. The phase of martensite is now known as body-centered tetragonal lattice structure, or BCT. The structure has now reoriented itself from the face-centered cubic structure known as austenite into BCT. As previously stated, the austenite contains 14 atoms, but has now reverted back to a 9-atom structure, but elongated. It should be further noticed that the volume and size of the new BCT structure has changed from the FCC structure. So once again, please note, a size change has occurred in the machined and carburized component. The newly formed martensitic case is very brittle and does require to be tempered after the martensite has been formed. Otherwise, crack initiation can occur at the surface. Once again, we show the body-centered tetragonal phase of the martensite structure, where we have one atom on each corner and back to one atom in the center, but now an elongated shape. And you will notice that there is a volumetric change in size. So therefore, there is a volumetric change in size in the finished component. There's an illustration or graphical illustration of the process of carburizing, showing where the changes take place and what the structural change is that occurs. A photomicrograph of a carburized martensitic case after quenching. You note the martensitic needles before tempering. The martensitic needles are called needles simply because they look like straw needles or steel needles all intermingled together. This shows some of the alloying elements that are added to the steel for when the steel is first manufactured, ranging from carbon right up to tungsten. The amount of alloying elements that is added depends on what the mechanical properties are to be achieved on that particular steel. Carbon is the universal hardener in all steels. It can be found in amounts from 0.01% right up to 2.3%. Thereafter, after 2.3%, it is considered to be cast iron. It does not take a significant amount of carbon to affect the hardness of the steel. This element will also interact with the elements listed below to form carbides. This is a graphical illustration of carbon content versus the maximum hardness values that one can achieve. And it shows the hardness value on the vertical axis and the percentage of carbon on the horizontal axis. Once the carbon content approaches or has even surpassed amounts greater than 1%, it will usually begin to combine with other elements such as chromium, molybdenum, vanadium, tungsten, cobalt, titanium, forming carbides of each of those elements. Sulfur. Sulfur is considered to be an impurity at the primary steel making, and it is deliberately reduced. However, there are instances when it is necessary to add sulfur in controlled amounts to improve the steel's machinability. Silicon. This material is used primarily as a deoxidizer during the steel making process. However, in large amounts it will begin to affect the steel's ductility. However, in the high alloy heat resisting steels, it will assist in the resistance of oxidation at high temperatures. Chromium. Chromium is found in a wide range of tool steels as well as carburizing steels. Chromium is one of the elements that has a strong tendency to form carbides with carbon in the steel during the heat treatment procedure. Chromium will assist in deep hardening, slight improvements in corrosion resistance, wear resistance because of the formation of chromium carbides. Nickel. Nickel will not form carbides with iron. It will, however, promote toughness when it combines with chromium and is added to promote toughness. It will also tend to reduce the steel's hardening temperature and is found in oil hardening steels rather than air hardening steels. The other thing about nickel is if nickel is there in high quantities or percentage values, nickel has a tendency to form hold on to what is called retained austenite. Nickel is usually found in quantities around 1%, but in some alloy cases of case hardening steels, it is higher. Tungsten. Tungsten will raise the hardening temperature or austenitizing temperature, and it forms very stable carbides with carbon. It will inhibit the grain growth at elevated temperatures and is also a very strong carbide former. Vanadium. Vanadium has two primary functions in steels. The first one as a grain refiner and the second as a stabilizer of carbides at high operating temperatures. It will also have a stabilizing effect on the martensite formation. This function makes it very difficult for the steel to be tempered, but it can be tempered. The cycle times on tempering tend to be longer and require multiple tempers. Molybdenum. Molybdenum will also form complex carbides with carbides. It will improve the deep hardening characteristics of the steel. It's usually found in concentrations of approximately up to 4% and 4% plus. It also makes the steel resistant to tempering and also assists in secondary hardening characteristics of tool steels. This shows the simple pack carburizing furnace system, and as you can see, the process retort is centered in the inside of the furnace. This shows the simple carburizing box with the components being immersed into the pack carburizing granulate and the furnace lid. Shows the changes that occur in terms of the phase change from body-centered cubic to face-centered cubic to tetragonal, body-centered tetragonal. The advantages of pack carburizing. It's an inexpensive process without any shadow of a doubt. It uses simple process materials. It does not require complex furnace construction engineering, and it's a very simple carburizing procedure. However, it does have disadvantages. There are no guarantees of consistent repeatability. It can be considered unhealthy due to the dust potential. Thirdly, it's old technology, but it is still workable. Conclusion. This now concludes the presentation on the subject matter of pack carburizing. Pack carburizing led to the development of gaseous carburizing and salt bath carburizing. It also provided the basic principles for low pressure carburizing as well as for plasma assisted carburizing. So it has played a significant role in the development of the carburizing process. The process played a significant part in the development of higher technology process methods of carburizing. Conclusion. It's hoped that this presentation has motivated you, the student, to continue your studies on the process of carburizing and hardening. It could be said of the process that it is an old process, but still it keeps finding new life. The writer and presenter would like to give thanks to Mr. Pankaj Deval and his team and his company, HT Courses. Finally, the writer and presenter gives sincere thanks to you, the students, for your work and your attention and commitment to gaining deeper and a more professional understanding of heat treatment in general, and in particular for carburizing. Yours most sincerely, David.